The year was 2347 when humanity finally cracked the secret of faster-than-light travel. The quantum fold drives changed everything overnight. Captain Daniel Hayes stood on the bridge of the Independence and watched the stars bend around his ship as they made their first jump beyond the solar system. He had 2 other ships with him, small exploration vessels filled with scientists and dreamers who wanted to see what lay beyond Earth. They had no idea they were about to stumble into a galaxy that had been inhabited for thousands of years. The Independence picked up strange signals near the Kepler 442 system. Daniel ordered his communications officer to try making contact. Within hours, 3 alien ships appeared out of nowhere. They were sleek and beautiful. Nothing like the boxy human vessels. Commander Lauren Blake, Daniel's second in command, tried to establish peaceful communication. The aliens responded, but their tone was not what anyone expected. The alien who spoke called himself Kelthir. He was a Vakros, a reptilian creature with scales that shimmered in the view screen. Behind him stood representatives of other species, creatures that looked like insects and others that seemed to be made of living crystal. Kelthir explained that the galaxy was governed by something called the Galactic Council. 17 species worked together to maintain order and peace. He said this with pride, as if humanity should feel grateful to learn about such a wonderful organization. Then Kelthir delivered the message that would change everything. Humanity was now under Council authority. All human worlds would pay tribute to the Council. Governors from Council species would oversee human affairs. Earth's military would be reduced to a small defensive force. Humanity would become what the Council called a client species, which was just a polite word for subjects. Kelthir made it sound reasonable, as if this was simply how things worked in the galaxy. Daniel Hayes listened to the entire speech without interrupting. He was a career military officer who had served in the colony wars. He knew what it meant when someone showed up at your door demanding submission. When Kelthir finished talking, Daniel smiled politely and said no. He explained that humanity governed itself and would be happy to establish trade and diplomatic relations as equals, but Earth would not accept foreign rulers. Kelthir seemed amused by this response. He looked at Daniel the way someone might look at a child who just said something foolish but cute. The Vakros explained that the Council was not making a request. This was how the galaxy worked. New species either joined peacefully or were forced to join. He gave humanity 1 standard galactic year to reconsider. If Earth refused to submit, the Council would send a military force to enforce compliance. Kelthir assured Daniel that resistance would be brief and pointless. After all, humanity only had 3 primitive ships. The Council had thousands. The Independence and her escorts returned to Earth immediately. Daniel went straight to military headquarters where Admiral Richard Cole was waiting. Richard was the head of Earth's United Space Command, a man who had spent 40 years preparing humanity for the day they might meet hostile aliens. He had hoped first contact would be peaceful. Now he knew better. The news spread quickly. Every government on Earth called emergency meetings. Some leaders argued for acceptance. They said fighting an empire of 17 species was insane. Earth would be destroyed. Billions would die. Maybe being a client species would not be so bad. Other leaders refused to even consider surrender. Humanity had spent centuries fighting for freedom and independence. They would not give it up just because some alien showed up with threats. President Helen Morris made the final decision. She was a former soldier herself, someone who understood what it meant to stand up to bullies. She addressed the entire planet in a speech that billions watched. Helen said that humanity would not bow to the Council. If they wanted Earth, they would have to take it by force. She authorized Admiral Richard to build a military fleet using every resource available. Money was no object. Time was no object. Survival was the only thing that mattered. The planet mobilized for war. Factories that made cars started making weapons. Shipyards that built cargo vessels started building warships. Every asteroid mining facility in the solar system switched to extracting metals for military use. Scientists who studied peaceful applications of technology now worked on making better weapons. Millions of people volunteered for military service. They trained in underground facilities on Earth, in rotating stations that simulated high gravity, in the harsh environment of Mars. Lieutenant Peter Grant was one of those volunteers. He had been a tactical officer on the Independence during first contact. Now he was assigned to train new recruits at the Fleet Academy on Luna. Peter spent 16 hours a day teaching young men and women how to fight in space. He showed them simulations of what Council ships could do. He taught them that the enemy was more advanced, more experienced, and had vastly superior numbers. Then he taught them that none of that mattered if they were willing to fight harder and smarter. The galaxy watched humanity's preparations with mild interest. Most species assumed Earth would surrender when the deadline approached. A few thought the humans might actually fight, but no one expected them to last more than a few days. The Council began assembling a military force to deal with Earth, but they did not take it seriously. They assigned 40 ships to the task, which was considered generous. In the past, the Council had conquered entire species with less. The months passed quickly. Admiral Richard worked with his staff to design a new class of warship. They called it the Freedom Class. The ships were ugly compared to Council vessels, just blocks of armor and weapons with engines strapped to the back. But they were built to take punishment and hit back hard. Human engineers took lessons from centuries of warfare and applied them to space combat. They built redundant systems so that ships could keep fighting even when damaged. They created weapons that Council shields were not designed to stop. They developed tactics based on speed and aggression, rather than the careful, formal battles the Council preferred. Colonel Jacob White oversaw construction at the Mars orbital yards. He watched as the first Freedom-class battleship took shape. It was massive, bristling with weapons that could tear apart asteroids. Jacob knew it might not be enough. 40 Council ships were still 40 Council ships, but humanity would make them pay for every inch of space. The deadline approached. Council Fleet Commander Zelthos assembled his force and began the journey to Earth. He expected this would be a simple police action. Show up, destroy a few human ships, and accept their surrender. He had no idea that waiting for him at Neptune was not a handful of primitive vessels, but a fully armed human battle fleet of 147 warships. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity did not make idle threats. When Earth said they would fight, they meant it. And they were very, very good at fighting. 11 months of preparation changed humanity forever. Every resource on Earth and throughout the solar system focused on one goal: building a fleet that could defend against the Council. Colonel Jacob White spent nearly every waking hour at the Mars orbital shipyards, watching the Freedom-class battleships take shape. These ships were different from anything the Council had ever seen. They were not elegant or beautiful. They looked like flying fortresses, covered in thick armor plating with weapons pointing in every direction. Each ship had backup systems for its backup systems. Human engineers knew that in real combat, things broke and people died. They designed ships that could lose half their systems and still keep fighting. The weapons humanity developed came from a darker place than most species understood. The Council races had been at peace for most of their history. When they did fight, they followed rules and traditions that made war almost civilized. Humanity had no such traditions. Earth's history was soaked in blood from thousands of wars. Humans knew how to kill efficiently, and they were not ashamed of it. Every weapon system installed on the new fleet was designed with one purpose: destroy the enemy as quickly as possible. Major Lisa Carter commanded the 7th Strike Wing, a squadron of fast attack corvettes. These small ships were packed with missiles and engines, nothing else. They had minimal armor and basic life support. Lisa's crews trained 20 hours a day in simulators, learning to fly at speeds that would kill most species. The human strategy was simple: hit hard, hit fast, and never stop moving. Lisa knew many of her pilots would not survive the first battle. She trained them anyway, because every enemy ship they destroyed meant fewer weapons firing at Earth. At the Luna Research Facility, Dr. Raymond Pierce made a discovery that would terrify the Council. He found a way to weaponize the quantum fold drives. By creating an unstable fold in space near an enemy ship, they could literally tear reality apart. Anything caught in the effect would be shredded at the atomic level. The weapon was dangerous and unpredictable. It burned out after a single use and had a significant chance of destroying the ship that fired it. Dr. Pierce recommended it anyway. Desperate times called for desperate weapons. Engineer Michelle Foster took Earth's old nuclear arsenal and adapted it for space warfare. Missiles carrying fusion warheads, railguns that fired solid metal slugs at incredible speeds, and energy weapons powered by antimatter. The Council used plasma cannons and particle beams. They had never faced kinetic weapons that traveled at significant fractions of light speed. Their shields were designed to deflect energy, not solid matter moving faster than anything they thought possible. Fleet Commander Zeltos arrived at the edge of human space with his 40 ships feeling confident. He was a Zrel, an insect-like species known for their tactical brilliance. Zeltos had fought in a dozen campaigns and never lost. He considered this assignment beneath his skills. Crushing a primitive species with overwhelming force was not warfare, it was pest control. He expected to find maybe 10 human ships defending their territory. What he found instead made him stop in shock. Arrayed in front of him was a human fleet of 147 warships organized into 7 distinct battle groups. The ships were crude-looking, but there were so many of them. Zeltos immediately contacted the Council, demanding to know how their intelligence could be so wrong. The Council had no answer. Somehow humanity had built a full military fleet in less than a year. It should have been impossible. Admiral Richard Cole stood on the bridge of his flagship and smiled when he saw the Council fleet halt. He knew what Zeltos was thinking. The alien commander was realizing that this would not be the easy victory he expected. Richard opened a communication channel that broadcast to every ship in both fleets. He wanted everyone to hear what came next, including every species in the galaxy that might be listening. Zeltos demanded that the human fleet stand down immediately. He said the Council was willing to show mercy if humanity surrendered without a fight. The occupation would be peaceful, and humanity would be treated fairly as a client species. It was humanity's last chance to avoid destruction. Admiral Richard's response was brief. He said that the Council came to Earth's home and threatened their families. They expected humanity to surrender without a fight. They were wrong. This was humanity's answer. Then he gave the order to open fire. The Battle of Neptune began with a sound that no one in space should have heard, but every human felt in their bones. Railguns fired from extreme range, hurling tungsten carbide projectiles at 30% of light speed. The Council's shields lit up as they tried to deflect the incoming fire. The shields worked perfectly against energy weapons. Against solid matter moving at relativistic speeds, they did almost nothing. 3 Council cruisers exploded in the first 10 seconds. The metal slugs punched through their hulls, through their interior compartments, through their engines, and out the other side. Atmosphere vented into space. Crew members were sucked out through the holes. The ships died before anyone inside understood what happened. Zeltos tried to restore order, but the human fleet was already moving. Commander Drake Sullivan led the vanguard in the battleship Valiant. His orders were to break the Council formation and create chaos. It was a crazy plan. In normal galactic warfare, ships stayed at a distance and exchanged fire in organized patterns. Drake charged straight into the Council line with his weapons blazing. The Valiant took hit after hit from Council plasma cannons. Her armor glowed red-hot but held. She fired back at close range, her weapons tearing through enemy shields that were not designed for point-blank combat. Then Drake did something that made Zeltos think humans were insane. He rammed a Council destroyer at full speed. The impact was catastrophic. The Valiant's reinforced prow crumpled the smaller ship like paper. Both vessels survived, but the destroyer was crippled, spinning out of control with its engines dead. Drake pulled his ship back and continued firing. His crew cheered as they destroyed another Council cruiser. Captain Angela Morris commanded the carrier Washington. She stayed back from the main battle and launched wave after wave of fighters. Hundreds of small craft piloted by young men and women who knew they were probably flying to their deaths. The Council had fighters too, but they used them as scouts and support craft, not primary weapons. Human fighters swarmed the Council ships like insects. They were too small and too fast for the big ship weapons to track. Pilot Officer Chris Bennett led his squadron through a gap in a cruiser's defenses and fired a nuclear missile directly into the engine core. The explosion lit up space like a new sun. Zeltos watched his fleet fall apart and could not understand what was happening. These humans fought like they had nothing to lose. Damaged ships did not retreat to safety. They pressed forward, firing until they were destroyed. It was terrifying. The battle raged for 6 hours without pause. Major Lisa Carter's 7th Strike Wing showed the Council what human hit-and-run tactics looked like. Her corvettes flew in formations that seemed random, but were actually carefully coordinated. They would appear from one direction, fire all their missiles, and disappear before the Council ships could properly target them. Then they would attack from a completely different angle. The Council vessels were built for stability and endurance. They could not turn fast enough to track the human ships. Dr. Raymond Pierce's experimental weapon made its first and only appearance during the third hour of battle. The battleship Independence positioned itself near a cluster of 5 council vessels. The crew activated the quantum destabilizer and space itself seemed to scream. Reality twisted in ways that hurt to look at. 2 council ships simply ceased to exist, torn apart at the molecular level. A third ship was caught at the edge of the effect. Its hull warped into impossible shapes, metal bent in directions that should not exist. The crew died instantly when their ship's atmosphere vented through the twisted metal. The weapon burned out completely after that single shot. The Independence had to withdraw from the battle with its main weapon system destroyed. But the psychological effect on the Council fleet was devastating. Zeltos received panicked reports from his captains demanding to know what kind of weapon could make ships vanish. He had no answer. Nothing in Council military history prepared him for this. Commander Drake Sullivan's Valiant continued to brawl at close range with any Council ship brave enough or foolish enough to engage. The battleship's armor was scarred and burned but still holding. Drake's crew fought with savage efficiency, their training taking over where conscious thought failed. Gunners fired as fast as the weapons could cycle. Damage control teams sealed breaches and rerouted power around destroyed systems. The ship was a mess, but she was still fighting. The fighters from the Washington scored victory after victory. Pilot Officer Chris Bennett led his squadron against a Council carrier, dodging defensive fire that could have vaporized his tiny craft. He watched 2 of his wingmen die in balls of fire but kept pressing forward. The mission mattered more than survival. He delivered his payload directly into the carrier's launch bay and destroyed it from the inside. Dozens of Council fighters were trapped and destroyed before they could launch. Zeltos tried everything he knew to restore order to his fleet. He attempted to regroup his ships into defensive formations. The humans broke those formations with suicidal charges. He tried to focus fire on individual human ships to destroy them one at a time. The human fleet split into smaller groups that operated independently, making concentrated fire impossible. He tried to use his superior numbers to surround and destroy parts of the human fleet. The humans simply refused to be surrounded, moving too fast and fighting too aggressively. The Council commander realized something that chilled him to his core. He was losing. His fleet had been cut in half, 20 ships destroyed completely, and another 10 so badly damaged they could barely move. The human losses were significant too, perhaps 20 vessels destroyed and 30 more damaged. But they were still fighting with the same intensity they showed at the start of battle. There was no fear in how they fought, no hesitation. It was like fighting machines that felt no pain. What Zeltos did not understand was that every human in the fleet knew what failure meant. If they lost this battle, the Council would attack Earth directly. Their families, their homes, everything they cared about would be destroyed or enslaved. The choice was simple: fight until you win or fight until you die. There was no middle ground, no surrender, no retreat. This was what humanity looked like when their backs were against the wall. Admiral Richard Cole watched the battle from his command ship and made constant adjustments to his strategy. He moved damaged ships to the rear where they could still contribute supporting fire. He rotated fresh vessels to the front line. He identified weak points in the Council formation and sent strike groups to exploit them. Richard had studied every recorded battle in human history. He knew that wars were won not by having better weapons or more ships, but by being willing to pay the higher price. Today, humanity was paying that price in blood. Zeltos finally admitted defeat. He could continue fighting and probably destroy more human ships, but his fleet would be annihilated in the process. The Council sent him to crush a primitive species, not to sacrifice his entire force. He gave the order that no Council commander had given in over 1,000 years. Retreat. His remaining ships activated their fold drives and disappeared into faster-than-light travel, fleeing back toward Council space. The human fleet did not pursue. They held position around Neptune, weapons still powered and ready in case the Council returned. Slowly, the reality of what happened began to sink in. They had faced the Galactic Council in open battle and won. Ships that were barely holding together began emergency repairs. Medical teams worked frantically to save wounded crew members. Rescue operations searched for survivors in the wreckage. The cost was heavy. 3,000 human beings died at Neptune. 3,000 men and women who volunteered to defend Earth and never went home. Every ship in the fleet held memorial services for the fallen. Admiral Richard attended as many as he could. standing silently while young officers read names of the dead. President Helen Morris addressed the planet from the Capitol. She stood at a podium with the flags of every Earth nation behind her. Her speech was broadcast throughout the solar system and beyond. She said that the Council came to make humanity slaves. Instead, they learned that humans bow to no one. She promised that this was not the end. The Council would come again with greater force. But humanity would be ready. They would always be ready. News of the battle spread through the galaxy at the speed of light. Every species that heard the report reacted with shock. The Galactic Council had been defeated in open combat by a species they considered primitive. It seemed impossible. Council representatives demanded detailed reports from Zeltos. They wanted to know how 40 ships could lose to human vessels that should have been inferior in every way. The Council convened an emergency session that lasted for days. Some species argued for immediate massive retaliation. The honor of the Council demanded it. Others suggested opening negotiations with humanity. Maybe this species was more dangerous than they appeared and war was not worth the cost. The Vecros leadership refused to consider peace. They would not allow a client species to humiliate the Council without consequences. A decision was made. The Council would assemble a war fleet unlike anything seen in living memory. 400 ships. Every species would contribute their finest vessels. Grand Admiral Tharkus, the greatest military commander the Council had ever produced, would lead the fleet personally. This time there would be no underestimating the humans. This time the Council would bring enough force to erase humanity from the stars forever. The message would be clear to every species in the galaxy. You do not defy the Council and survive. The Second Battle of Earth began at the Mars Orbital Defense Line. Admiral Richard Cole positioned his fleet between Mars and Earth, using the red planet as an anchor point for his defensive formation. The Council fleet emerged from fold space in a display meant to intimidate and terrify. 400 warships representing the combined military might of 17 alien species appeared all at once, their formation perfect and their weapons ready. Commodore Daniel Hayes watched from the bridge of the Independence. He had been promoted after Neptune and now commanded an entire battle group. The numbers were terrifying, but his crew had fought Council ships before. They knew the enemy could bleed and die just like anyone else. Fear was natural, but it would not stop them from doing their duty. Grand Admiral Tharkus broadcast a message demanding immediate surrender. His words were translated into English and sent across every communication channel. He promised that if Earth surrendered now, the occupation would be merciful. Humanity would be integrated into the Council as a protected species. There would be no orbital bombardments, no mass executions, no destruction of cities. All they had to do was accept Council authority. President Helen Morris responded personally. She wanted her words broadcast not just to the Council fleet but to every listening post in the galaxy. Every species needed to hear what humanity had to say. She told Tharkus that he came with 400 ships expecting humanity to bow in fear. He promised mercy if they surrendered. But humanity had seen what Council mercy looked like. They would make humans into servants and call it protection. She had a different proposal. Turn around and go home. Tell the Council that Earth would never surrender. And if the Council forced this fight, humanity would show them what true war looked like. This was the only warning they would receive. Tharkus was insulted by the response. A primitive species was lecturing him about warfare. He was a Grand Admiral who had commanded fleets for 50 years. These humans had been in space for less than 2 years. He gave the order to attack. The Council fleet advanced in a massive wall formation, shields glowing with power and weapons charging. Admiral Richard waited patiently as the enemy crossed into the range he had carefully calculated. Then he activated the trap that took 3 months to prepare. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter had been seeded with thousands of stealth mines. They activated all at once, creating a storm of explosions throughout the Council formation. 20 ships were destroyed immediately, torn apart by blasts they never saw coming. Dozens more suffered damage. The perfect formation collapsed into chaos. Before Tharkus could restore order, the human fleet attacked with everything they had. This time, humanity was not holding anything back. Every ship, every weapon, every desperate trick they developed, Commodore Daniel led the charge in the Independence. The battleship had been rebuilt after Neptune, her weapons upgraded and her armor reinforced. She crashed into the Council line like a hammer. The battleship Defiance, commanded by Captain Ryan Foster, demonstrated new shield breaker missiles. These weapons phased through enemy shields using technology that should have been impossible. They detonated inside Council ships, tearing them apart from within. The Council scientists who examined the wreckage later could not explain how the weapons worked. Human physics apparently operated on different rules. Colonel Jacob White's Freedom carried the most powerful railgun ever constructed. Each shot consumed enough energy to power a city for a week. The weapon could only fire 3 times before needing a complete recharge. Jacob made every shot count. 3 Council battleships died, each one punched through by projectiles traveling at 40% of light speed. The slugs went completely through the ships and continued into space, still carrying enough energy to destroy anything they hit. The carrier Washington launched every fighter it carried. Captain Angela Morris had trained her pilots for exactly this moment. Hundreds of small craft swarmed into the battle, engaging in desperate dogfights among the massive capital ships. Pilot Officer Chris Bennett led his squadron against a Council carrier, destroying its launch bays before the enemy fighters could deploy.
He survived by flying through explosions and debris that would have killed a less skilled pilot. Major Lisa Carter's strike wings operated in the chaos like predators hunting in a storm.
Her corvettes were fast and deadly, hitting targets and disappearing before the enemy could respond. Lisa knew her ships were expendable. Each one that reached its target could take down an enemy vessel 10 times its size. It was brutal mathematics, but the equation worked. They were buying time for the heavy battleships to break the Council fleet. Dr. Raymond Pierce's team built a second quantum destabilizer, this one mounted on a hidden space station behind Luna. When activated, it created a massive fold space anomaly that scattered the Council fleet across a huge volume of space. Ships that were close enough to support each other suddenly found themselves light minutes apart, unable to coordinate or combine their fire. The Council fleet stopped being a unified force and became hundreds of individual ships fighting alone. The battle dissolved into thousands of smaller engagements. Human ships fought with desperate courage, knowing that failure meant Earth would burn. Council ships fought with growing fear as they realized these humans were not just willing to die. They seemed eager to take enemies with them. Damaged human vessels did not retreat to safety. They charged forward, reactors overloading, weapons firing until the ships broke apart. Lieutenant Commander Jennifer Shaw commanded a destroyer that took heavy damage early in the battle. Her engines were failing and her weapons were nearly depleted. She made a decision that her crew supported without question. They set course directly for a Council battleship, the destroyer's reactor rigged to overload on impact. The collision destroyed both vessels in a blast of light. The battleship happened to be the Fleet Command ship. Grand Admiral Tharkis died in the explosion, his brilliant tactical mind silenced forever. Without their commander, the Council fleet began to fall apart. Different species had different ideas about how to proceed. The Vakros wanted to press the attack and avenge their fallen admiral. The Drell suggested a tactical withdrawal to regroup and plan a new strategy. The Aeon calculated that the odds of victory were dropping rapidly and recommended immediate retreat. While they argued, the human fleet pressed their advantage. Admiral Richard saw the enemy's confusion and ordered a general advance. Every human ship surged forward, weapons blazing. It was a calculated risk because his fleet was battered and running low on ammunition. But Richard gambled that the Council fleet would break before his did. He was right. The Council ships began to withdraw, folding space and fleeing back toward their territory. They left behind wreckage and debris, the remains of over 200 destroyed vessels. The human fleet was in terrible shape with only 60 ships still combat capable, but they had won. Earth erupted in celebration when news of the victory reached the planet. Billions of people who had spent months in fear and uncertainty finally allowed themselves to believe they might survive. Cities across the globe held memorial services for the fallen, while simultaneously celebrating the victory. It was a strange mixture of grief and joy, mourning the dead while honoring their sacrifice. Humanity had faced the full military might of the Galactic Council, and not only survived but won decisively. Admiral Richard Cole stood on the bridge of his damaged flagship and felt no joy. He understood that this victory, as complete as it seemed, was not the end of anything. The Council would regroup. They would build new ships and train new crews. They would come back, perhaps in a year or perhaps in 10 years, but they would return. An empire that had ruled for 10,000 years would not accept defeat from a species they considered primitive. Richard immediately began planning for the next phase of the war. already thinking about how to defend Earth against an even larger fleet. What Richard did not know was that the galaxy was changing in ways the Council could not control. On a dozen worlds, species that had lived under Council rule for centuries watched humanity's defiance with growing interest. If humans could stand against the Council and win, perhaps others could as well. The first rebellion started on a world called Dranis, home to a species that had been conquered 3,000 years ago. They rose up against their Council governors and declared independence. The Council sent ships to crush the rebellion, but found that the Dranis had somehow acquired human weapons and human military advisors. More rebellions followed. Minor species that had accepted Council rule because they saw no alternative suddenly found hope in humanity's example. The Council's empire, stable for millennia, began to fracture. Council leaders convened emergency sessions trying to understand how everything fell apart so quickly. They blamed humanity for spreading chaos and undermining galactic order. They were not entirely wrong. 6 months after the Second Battle of Earth, 8 species sent representatives to Earth requesting an alliance. They arrived in modest ships, careful not to appear threatening. President Helen Morris welcomed them personally, standing in the newly constructed Alliance Hall built specifically for this moment. The representatives were nervous, knowing that the Council would view this meeting as treason. But they were also determined. They had seen what freedom looked like, and they wanted it for their own people. Admiral Richard attended the first Alliance meeting alongside President Morris. The discussions lasted for weeks as they worked out the terms of mutual defense and cooperation. Some species wanted humanity to lead the alliance, viewing humans as the only ones strong enough to stand against the Council. Richard refused. He explained that humanity did not fight a war to replace one empire with another. The alliance would be a partnership of equals, or it would be nothing. Captain Victoria Lane was promoted to admiral and given command of Alliance intelligence operations. Her stealth ships, now joined by vessels from allied species, operated throughout the galaxy gathering information and conducting covert missions. Victoria's success at Kepler 186 made her a legend among the Allies. The Council put a massive bounty on her head, but she continued her work, always staying one step ahead of enemy hunters. The Council watched these developments with growing alarm and anger. Their empire was crumbling, and they blamed humanity for everything. Council propaganda painted humans as warmongers and chaos bringers who destroyed the peace the galaxy had enjoyed for thousands of years. Some Council species believed the propaganda. Others quietly questioned whether a peace built on subjugation was worth preserving. The war continued, but it looked different now. Instead of massive fleet battles, the conflict became a series of smaller engagements across hundreds of systems. Human tactics and weapons spread throughout the alliance. Every allied species adapted human military doctrine to their own needs. The Council, accustomed to fighting in traditional ways, struggled to counter enemies who refused to fight by the old rules. Major Lisa Carter, now General Carter, commanded the Alliance Military Academy, where officers from 30 different species learned human combat tactics. Her training methods were harsh and demanding, but effective. Graduates of her academy became some of the most feared commanders in the galaxy. The Council learned to their cost that fighting one species trained in human warfare was bad enough. Fighting 30 species all using human tactics was a nightmare. Commodore Daniel Hayes commanded the Alliance fleet, a combined force that grew larger every year as more species joined. The Independence served as his flagship, a symbol of humanity's first journey into the galaxy and their refusal to bow to tyranny. Daniel led diplomatic missions as often as military ones, helping to integrate new species into the Alliance and negotiate with neutral powers. The Council still existed, but as a shadow of its former glory. Only 5 species remained loyal, and they controlled perhaps a tenth of the territory they once ruled. The Council leadership finally agreed to peace negotiations, though the talks proceeded slowly. Neither side fully trusted the other, and both expected the war to resume eventually. Admiral Richard Cole retired after 5 years of constant warfare. He was tired and wanted to spend time with his family while he still could. President Morris appointed him as humanity's ambassador to the Alliance, a position that kept him busy, but no longer required him to send people to their deaths. Richard attended countless diplomatic functions and treaty negotiations, always working to strengthen the bonds between Alliance members. Earth transformed into the heart of the Alliance. The Sol system became the most heavily defended location in the galaxy, with weapons platforms, defense stations, and patrol fleets that could repel any conceivable attack. No hostile force would ever threaten humanity's home again. That was a promise Richard made, and one that every human took seriously. Humanity's population exploded across the galaxy. Colonies were established on hundreds of worlds. Human merchants traded with every species willing to do business. Human culture, art, music, and literature spread throughout civilized space. Humans became known not just as warriors, but as innovators, explorers, and idealists who genuinely believed that freedom was worth fighting for. 10 years after first contact, the galaxy was unrecognizable. The Council's empire had collapsed. The Alliance of Free Species controlled more territory than the Council ever did. Humanity, the species the Council tried to enslave, was now seen as the liberator of the galaxy. It was ironic and fitting in equal measure. The lesson was written in the wreckage of 1,000 ships and carved into the memory of every species that witnessed humanity's rise. Never underestimate those who fight for their home. Never assume that primitive means weak. Never threaten someone's family and expect them to surrender quietly. And most importantly, never mistake humanity's desire for peace as inability to wage war. The Council learned these lessons the hard way. They came expecting easy conquest and found warriors who refused to bow. They threatened Earth and discovered that humans would burn the galaxy down before accepting chains. The stars belong to everyone now, not just the strong or the old. Freedom had a price, and humanity proved they were willing to pay it. The galaxy was better for that lesson, even if the cost was measured in blood and fire.